Hello and welcome to another episode of Roll for Mutation, which is a podcast about TTRPG post-apocalyptic games. My name is Lowell, pronouns he, him, and I am joined by Marc Majcher.
Hi there, I am Mark, and my pronouns are he and them.
And today we're doing we've jumped forward in time. I think that's the only way we can
A little bit.
say that. Yeah. We've done some of the big classics in the past three episodes, and today we're coming forward to a more recent game. So this is a recent game, Apocalypse World, as you know. It is one with a very long tail. It's probably longer than any that we recorded so far.
Absolutely.
As we're recording this right now, the burnt over Kickstarter for the new edition of Apocalypse World is a week away. So this is going to come out like well after that
Yeah.
has come and been. But that's our sort of time that we're looking at. This is also different in that all of the games that we've covered so far have had multiple editions and multiple splat books and all of those kinds of things. This is a book. This is a single book. There's some add-ons, and we're going to kind of focus on that. We're going to focus on Apocalypse World as Apocalypse World and Apocalypse World as a post-apocalyptic game
Mm.
with a kind of a touching on PbtA. Now, Marc, how did you come to Apocalypse World? Did you come to it from that or from another game, or what was that?
Yeah. So early, mid, late 2000, the 2000s, I was active on the Forge and on story games and hung out with Vincent and them at Gen Con when I used to go and have a lot of games from that era. And the first edition of Apocalypse World I got was one of the ash cans that Vincent was selling at Gen Con that had wallpaper for the covers that he screen printed on. And yeah, it was just super cool watching the development process on the forums and stuff. And the text was something that a lot of people had not seen before. And it was just really exciting at the time and continues to be.
I didn't play it right away. I bought the PDF of it, and there was a friend of mine who was running a Fallout game, and I handed a copy of that off to him to look at it, and he came back and he said, "What the fuck is this?" And I was like, okay. And it was later, once kind of Dungeon World was
Mhm.
in motion, I played Monster of the Week in Dungeon World. And then Rich eventually, I played Apocalypse World with him kind of after I knew what PbtA was. But I had kind of been following along, and I have a couple of weird anecdotes about that later. So we're going to start. We break our things down. We talk about the pitch. We talk about sort of gaming history, and then we're going to talk a little bit about media influences, and then our general thoughts. So I'm going to start with what kind of the pitch is for Apocalypse World. It is a little challenging to do this, given how much and what it has spawned, and how much all of that has changed the landscape of gaming since its release. I've gone back and looked at the times, the before times, but 2010s and before, and like the different games that we were having, a lot of odd, very trad style things and some wild indie attempts, and this does definitely shift the direction of gaming. Now, Apocalypse World itself is set in a undefined post-apocalyptic world. It's the first of the games that we've seen this in. While there's no setting specifics on offer, there's generally a vibe of Mad Max, there's a British film Doomsday, or Fallout stripped of nostalgia and some of the comedy. It exists far enough after the fall that the PCs didn't experience the previous world, but there's an implication that there may be those living with vague memories of that lost past. I think that's kind of built into the text. The game changes the standard RPG approach across the board in some very little ways and some very big ways. There's almost no preamble or setup in that core book. That first one, as you go to it, it's here are the character types, they explain them, and then we roll into characters. with the explanation of mechanics happening in parallel. And that's very different from a lot of games at that time. Everything focuses around those characters. The whole purpose and narrative of the game is built around that rather than we breaking that out to a character creation section. We still have some breakouts in terms of those playbooks, like character classes, but there's a shift in what we're introducing you to that tells us something about the focus of play.
Mhm.
More importantly, and this is going to be a big issue and thing to talk about, everything in the game is presented conversationally. Apocalypse World talks about the game as conversation, and then it demonstrates that by making the teach conversational. So it's shifting between first and second person, with the later telling you what you need to be doing, and the former expressing the designer's voice as the MC or Master of Ceremonies, our GM term. It's a little like listening to the director's commentary of a game. It deliberately and specifically undercuts the voice of objectivity, of distance, and authority that are found in traditional games. There's still a kind of voice of wisdom, but we've moved away from a very authorial, heavy voice. And it is also crass, aggressive, filled with expletives, and incredibly visceral. The tone reflects the world and the mechanics. And at that time, the tone polarized many readers and reviewers. It was such a change. It was so in your face. I don't want to say punk, but it was a little punk. And it, in fact, pushed off people who were in the indie scene, who I would normally have expected to be receptive to this. One of my first recollections, that actually is the thing that got me to order it, was reading a piece by Will Hindmarch where he went, "Oh, this system is great, but I have some objections to the tone." And like really going on about how much he disliked the writing and stuff. And I was like, okay, what is going on here that he's having such a reaction to it? And it was so strange, given his role in the indie scene. And again, I think there is a little echo of the edgy punk rock in your face games of the 1990s. I'm thinking particularly of Human Occupied Landfill. But this doesn't feel like an act or a facade. Instead, the tone is that way because the game is that way. Apox World, if you've played in the scene, PbtA, it introduced several mechanical choices that would have long-lasting impact on gaming. The idea of moves, specific mechanical sets, you do a thing, and then there is this thing that you roll that takes a slice of the resolution. Playbook moves for characters as defining the character concept. The idea that something always happens when you roll, a logical outgrowth of the fail forward, and there's a ton more. In particular, what I think is important for our look at this is some of the mechanics really lean into and reinforce the post-collapse feeling and the idea of desperate connections in a fallen world. Each playbook has a sex move, which activates when you share intimacy with someone. And again, intimacy doesn't have to be sex, but it kind of is described that way to give us a flavor of what's going on. And the particular sex move that your character has tells us something about them. It gives flavor to their interactions. It says how they connect with other people. Characters have a history or what's called an HX score, which measures a connection to other PCs. The play itself centers on threat and stress. There's little required GM prep. Instead, there's a toolkit of fronts for deploying and increasing the dangers of those fronts and threats. And generally, when you look at it, you don't have much to fall back on. Things are going to happen. And that general lethality of the game means that Apocalypse World always feels risky and dangerous. Things can always go badly for you. There's very little you can fall back on, but everything is out there. The GM can disclaim, well, there's the move. You made the move. Here's what we rolled. Let's go on. I'll also say that kind of going back to the talk of how it's written, examples in the text create their own tone. There's some sense of the adversarial GM, but written very deliberately to kind of make it almost a joke there because it's tempered by the sense of fairness and that there's a collaborative pressure that goes on. as I said, there's the idea of disclaiming responsibility that is intended kind of to remove some of the sense that the GM has been planning to fuck you over, despite the fact that a lot of the things in the book are described as fuckery, and there's an advanced fuckery section in some of these things. One of the other things that we see in those examples is a lot of hostility and conflict suggested in the play examples between PCs and NPCs, between PCs and PCs. Those examples read together suggest a world where the PCs have to connect, but they don't necessarily have to help one another. And they're going to have agendas that may be at odds. There's a lot of other things about the system, the idea of the GM reacting rather than pushing things forward that comes out of previous things in the indie scene. There's a lot to talk about there. So, you know PBTA or you don't know it in some ways. Apocalypse World is a really interesting template mechanically, but that's the pitch for the game. Have I missed anything big that I ought to say about what the pitch is, Marc, before I throw to you to kind of give us the gaming history context?
I think you hit the biggest part of the pitch, which is not that it's like anti how trad games were portrayed or pitched themselves, but kind of a not even a reaction, just kind of like a explanation of the baker's kind of home play style,
Hmm.
uh, as opposed to what a lot of people believe they needed to do according to more traditional books. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, there definitely is a feeling like this is how it plays at the table,
Yeah,
rather than here is how the designer envisions it.
yeah. And
And
I guess maybe
that's a
the
shift.
maybe the strong point there is like Meg and Vincent are players of role playing games,
Hmm.
and I think Apocalypse World is written as a player or to a player, or with GMs or MCs being players as well.
Right,
And I think just because of the needs of publishing, just a lot of the volume of more traditional books, especially like Vampire and all that, were written by people who didn't necessarily play the things that they specifically wrote. Like
right.
a lot of writing to make books, and Apocalypse World is written to make a game. I think that's an interesting difference.
And I think that you're actually pointing at that like GM as player is certainly something that comes as a thing we're saying a lot more at this time. And I think that you're right. Is I hadn't quite put that together that like this is what that book is really doing.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
have something fun to say about that later on too, I think.
okay. Well, I want to throw to you about the context of the bakers and the gaming history and that then.
Yeah, so the history of Apocalypse World goes way back to mid 2000s. We can trace that history of the bakers and sort of indie game scene in general to The Forge, which was an online game discussion forum community made by Ron Edwards to specifically talk about getting game designers to publish their work. Back then, it was more difficult to publish things online. There were, I think Lulu was the main thing, but a lot of people spent a lot of money that did not need to be spent, like ordering runs of thousands of books that never got sold. And so the Forge was aimed at game designers publishing their own works in a way that was useful and sustainable. And Meg and Vincent Baker were a big part of that. There's a lot of history of the Forge outside of Apocalypse World, and there's a book on that topic by Bill White, Tabletop RPG Design in Theory and Practice at the Forge, 2001 to 2012. It is an academic book. It is thorough, and it is
Yes.
a lot of good history.
Yeah.
Thorough. But yeah, the short version is that the Forge was an online hub and kind of even like a central distribution point of a lot of indie TTRPGs in the 2005, 2010 around then. A lot of designers that people might recognize came out of there. Megan Vincent, John Harper, Paul Shega, all them. It was not only a forum for talking about how to publish stuff, but of course also how to design games and a lot of the theory around there. And a lot of the stuff you'll hear about the Forge is about theory discussions, for better or for worse. But a lot of that, it was a reaction to traditional design, and not, again, not even like antithetical to that, but more like, hey, let's look at this kind of for what it is instead of as tradition, and let's actually talk about it instead of going along with it. The Bakers specifically, they produce games like Kill Puppies for Satan, Dogs in the Vineyard, Poisoned, which is a pirate game, In a Wicked Age, a lot of stuff like that, which, could be seen as edgy, and some of that was intentional, I think. But yeah, other games around that time that were, apocalypsy. We had, seventh edition of Gamma World, Legend of the Five Rings. There was DC Adventures, Mutants and Masterminds, third edition. Laundry, Smallville, Leverage was out then, which was great. Kind of getting towards the indie side. There was the big book of the Dresden Files RPG, Free Market by Jared Sorensen, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
Strands of Fate, Cthulhu Dark by Graham Walmsley, Icons, Kingdom of Nothing, which I think I have around here somewhere. But yeah, a lot of just a really varied foundation for a lot of the stuff that we kind of take for granted these days to build on.
We're just a few years after the D20 crash. So that
Yeah.
that has really burned out, and D&D 4 has not caught fire.
Yeah.
And so we do have this just, everything going in different directions. Storyteller, which had been such a juggernaut for a long time, is splintered. So there really is a space there for some new directions.
Yeah, yeah, and people kind of wanting, gamers are, they have the two faces. They have the face of tradition, where like this is the game we've always played, and we want to play it that way. But also, in the same breath, we want something new, and we don't want just the same thing over and over again. I think the Forge slash story game scene really provided some fodder for that second phase of new things. And so Apocalypse World came out 2010 officially, and immediately thereafter spawned a lot of games based on it. It explicitly encourages hacking and drifting, and the powered by the Apocalypse, not brand, label, I guess. Any game that is inspired by Apocalypse World can label itself powered by the Apocalypse, whether it necessarily derives from those mechanics or not.
Mhm.
But a lot of the early games did derive strongly from the specific mechanics. We had Carrie, the Warren, Monster of the Week, Dungeon World, Monster Hearts, and then a little bit later on, there was Masks, Hearts of Wulin, The Watch, The Veil, Worldwide Wrestling, and then more recent games like Apocalypse Keys, Void Heart Symphony, The Between, Rapscallion, a lot of the Magpie stuff. And there are actually, of the relatively few post-apocalyptic games built on PbtA, there's stuff like The Happiest Apocalypse on Earth, Last Fleet, Dream Askew, and Heart, which spawned their own thing. Legacy, Life Among the Ruins, stuff like Zombie World, even Blades in the Dark, arguably. Not arguably. John Harper said it was originally so.
Oh yeah.
Kind of the parents are Apocalypse World and Cthulhu Dark. But yeah, so much design around Apocalypse World and that space, both post-apocalyptic and otherwise. So that went strong for a while. In 2016, the Bakers released the second edition with a very successful Kickstarter. And it changed some things, but still kept a really strong core of what the game actually was. There was some new moves. They changed combat around a little bit more and made it a little bit more tactical, and added some support moves. There was some stronger vehicular combat things and gang conflict stuff. There were some more chase, tracking, subterfuge moves. Single combat was a little bit different and a little bit easier, arguably. They changed some core moves like Seize the Force and got rid of some of the optional battle stuff from first edition. And they also officially included some of the new playbooks that had come out in the time. There was the Majcher D, who operated some kind of establishment, a bar or a club. I think they removed the operator playbook and moved some of that other stuff there. They added the Faceless, I think, to second edition. And the legacy, I think it wasn't there. I think they're doing that in third edition. Very
Okay.
important. They did add some stuff for supporting sort of lifestyle, economy, gig work stuff. They updated the harm moves. And I think one of the biggest important changes was getting rid of fronts, which I think people still use
Hmm.
unofficially in favor of this threat map, which is neat. And again, I think that's a reflection of the way that it was actually played by the bakers at home. And so that I feel like second edition was really well received, and there was some discussion about it, but it feels like Powered by the Apocalypse had kind of a huge momentum at that point that second edition didn't really mechanically affect too many games
Hmm.
that were based on it after that, which was still cool. But again, the Apocalypse World continued to be played by the bakers and by others, and now they are doing the burned over one. 2019, they released the burned over kind of like hack ish. I don't know if it was an ash can, but it was a in development. And they had changed some of the stuff that was tweaked for maybe a younger audience, or definitely a broader audience. They took out the special moves. The sex moves are no longer in there. And some of the language has been like the tone hasn't been brought down, but I think some of the language has been brought down
Hmm.
to kind of address some of those concerns of being put off by that kind of that language.
And we'll link to Thomas Manuel's
Yeah,
article on Rascal
yeah,
interviewing about that I think is really solid for analyzing their authorial intent with
yeah,
this new edition.
yeah, very much so. And Meg and Vincent are some of the most thoughtful designers, but also the most thoughtful people I've run into. And the way they talk about the game design process is really unlike almost anyone else I talk to because it's very, it comes from a very personal place instead of a very theoretical place. Although
Hmm.
there's a lot of theoretical musings on Vincent's blogs and whatnot. It feels like all of the apocalypse world design comes from concrete play, which is really one of the main thrusts of the old Forge design. The design should come from play instead of from theory, even though there's a lot of theorizing going on.
And the other thing we'll mention is for a long time, Marshall Miller, designer of the Warren,
Mm,
was putting together kind of a history, an analysis, like a gathering of the different PbtA games and where they came from and things like that. I don't know how that project, where it's at right now. We need to look at it, but Google sucks.
yeah,
And it's very difficult for me to find it as of kind of this morning when I was going, oh yeah, I should look for that.
yeah. And I think it's also been a victim of the success because for the first few years, it was easy to say, here's a page with all of the PbtA games on it. And that's literally impossible now.
Yeah,
You can't keep track of that.
yeah.
One of the blogs that I had been reading for a while to kind of get a really deep understanding of the differences between editions was Jason D'Angelo's Daily Apocalypse. He basically went through the book chapter by chapter, paragraph by paragraph,
Oh
sometimes
wow.
doing liturgical analysis almost. So that's a really great read if you're deep into it.
Yeah, we'll have a link to that as well as, of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention Plus One Forward. The
Mhm.
very early days of PbtA,
Absolutely.
Rich and company ended up like interviewing a lot of different PbtA designers
Mhm.
about a specific game, making them kind of run. And it's really interesting insight into each of these designers' reactions to PbtA,
Mhm.
how they position themselves in relation to that. It's also I'm going to say this, I'm going to be so mean. Besides the fact that Rich never had me on the show, so I'm going to say that and be pissed about that. But that some designers are very good at selling their game
Yes.
and presenting it, and some designers are not.
Yep.
So it's a real showcase of that.
Yeah, and an interesting part of that was I believe it's the show I'm thinking of, which I'm pretty sure it is. that they actually did a little bit of play on the show.
Yes, yes,
But
always ends with a little bit
like
of
at the
play.
table. Yeah.
It's Rich and Rach, I think
Yeah.
I missed the name earlier, so I'll try and so I'm apologizing for that.
Yeah.
Let me talk about the media history here. And in particular, I'm originally looking at this from the first edition. Apocalypse World First Edition has a ludography of games, but not media inspirations in that first edition. What I'm going to talk about is some big features you can pull from that. The second edition does add a list of inspirations, and I'll swing back to that at the end to mention a couple of what I think are neat ones from that.
Yeah.
So, in terms of look and an approach, obviously the Road Warrior and Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome are real keystones. There's a thematic connection there, but more importantly, there's a visual connection.
Mhm.
Baker used modified stock art images that generally look like characters drawn from those movies. Buff, ragged, gas masked, weird. I may be off on this, but it feels like one of those cases where this like easier and more accessible tool and approach really like it was a great choice and really played in it created a visual distinction, a visual thing where sometimes when a game has a real highly stylized blocky black and white, like I despise Dan Smith's art from GURPS, but this really feels good.
Mhm.
It's easier to access, black and white material. It sets up a vibe. I think that's really good. And then again, Fury Road would come out about 5 years after Apocalypse World, but it's like, oh, it feels like George Miller played Apocalypse World in some ways there. A combination of Apocalypse World and Car Wars.
Yeah.
Um,
And Vincent actually published a tutorial on his blog on how to do that specific style of art in Photoshop,
oh,
and
wow.
other people, so other people could use it for third party playbooks and
Well,
stuff.
I love that kind of thing.
Yeah.
A lot of the visual touches and motifs that we're talking about from World Warrior and Mad Max, we would also see them as an easy template for a lot of low budget American and Italian post-apocalyptic apocalypse exploitation films. You could see that in Cyborg, 2019 After the Fall of New York, Warrior of the Lost World, Exterminators of the Year 3000. Some of these have been on Mystery Science Theater, of course. But now in the modern era, we're getting these in beautifully restored Blu-ray editions, which just seems wild to me. Tangential, but I think also really interesting is in terms of a visual thing that we've seen out in public is the Wasteland Weekend. This is an
Mhm.
annual 4-day event on the edge of the Mojave Desert where folks cosplay the post-apocalypse. It began in 2010, the same year as Apocalypse World released. There's something in the water at that point. And boy, it looks like an Apocalypse World game.
Yeah.
If you go to search for the images, you're like, oh, okay, they're cosplaying PbtA. There's a few other post-apocalypse films of the era which fit with this rough, almost realistic approach to the setting. Doomsday, 2008, takes a lot of inspiration from Mad Max and the Warriors to create a fallen Great Britain. Reign of Fire from 2002 has dragons, but much of the look and feel match. And 28 Weeks Later, despite being a zombie movie, also captures this. A couple of other films feel like they speak indirectly, more thematically to Apocalypse World. So The Road kind of has a near the fall setting. And then, of course, there's Terminator Salvation in 2009, the year before PbtA comes out. So the other big signpost of this era for post-apocalyptic gaming that I think anything post-apocalyptic has to respond to in the early 2000s is Fallout.
Yeah.
So the original two Fallouts had released in the late 1990s, and they had a strong influence on other games, but company problems and corporate pressure meant that development had stalled. They did a couple of less well-received games, but Fallout was there. And according to legend, Fallout originally started as a GURPS adaptation, which you can definitely still feel in the game,
Yes.
but actually split when Steve Jackson objected to the game's violence, a thing I'm going to come back to
Which is, yeah.
tangentially later on. But in 2008, Bethesda's Fallout 3, it grabbed everybody's attention. Like Fallout 3 dominated the gaming landscape, and it was followed up by the enormously successful Fallout New Vegas in 2010. And and this is just me. But in some ways, I feel like Apocalypse World is kind of a repudiation of some of what's happening in Fallout. The comedy that Apocalypse World leans into is very different. It doesn't bask in nostalgia. It makes the relationships messy rather than mechanical. There's no sense of the vault and a savior from the past world element. They occupy the same genre and overlap strongly, but they feel very different to me. And I think you have to see Apocalypse World, at least in part, in conversation with Fallout, responding to it. Fallout, in some ways, is closer to something like Metro 2033,
Yeah.
which came out in 2010, and that's based on a Russian novel from 2005. So there is, as I mentioned, a list of media influences, a thematic, these are inspirations in the back of the second edition. These include a lot of the usual suspects, but I'll mention a couple that struck me. Action movies that are not in sort of post-apocalypse, Domino and Centurion, both movies, high octane, very visceral, but also tone pieces like Deadwood, Beasts of the Southern Wild, and Cormac McCarthy, author of The Roads, Blood Meridian. And they also mentioned Die Antwoord's I Think You Freaky.
Uh,
So some other very vibes there. They also mentioned some interesting nonfiction in there, including a book called A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disasters. So there are a lot of things in that list that present themes and undercurrents, if not explicit mechanical focus. But I think more importantly, for some considerations, is there's also a separate set of reference books in there for sex education,
yeah.
like a response to some of the critique and discussion, I think, around PbtA.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about that. What do you general thoughts? The topics that we could talk about, PbtA as a game, as a post-apocalyptic game. What do you want to discuss?
Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned near the end there, it's not even the lack of nostalgia, it's almost explicitly like anti-nostalgia.
Hmm.
Because aside from the one playbook, like people don't remember what the apocalypse was. They don't remember things from before the apocalypse. And even as players, you are encouraged not to build on previous things, but not to plan ahead, not to draw. I don't know how to say that. You are still drawing from your experience and media touchstones, but a lot of it is really focused on the present, the present moment of play, the present moment of the world in the fiction, instead of looking backwards and kind of going, "Oh, that was cool. How can we integrate that into present day stuff?"
Yeah, there's no move for finding ancient relics.
Yeah.
Like that's such a core part of Gamma World and Dying Earth post-apocalypse and all of those things is we find a relic of the old world, we don't understand it, and we can put it to use, and we have to do some mechanics for that. That is just not in there at all.
Yeah, 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 and that's like almost reflected in the kind of anti-prep philosophy to it too. Like there are explicit instructions in the game, like do not plan stuff ahead. We really mean it. Yeah, it's just focusing on what your players are doing at the moment at the table,
Hmm.
in the moment at the table, and it's really different than a lot of the kind of pre-planned storyline things that you saw a lot of back then and still see now with larger and kind of actual play media of like there's a story we're telling and you're just watching it.
I have a really very strong emotional and specific memory of reading precursor to this, reading Dogs in the Vineyard
Mm-hmm.
and being like, okay, I don't quite understand mechanics of this, blah, 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 reading through it and hitting the point where he says, come up with what the problem is in this town,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it.
Yeah.
Do nothing else. and like really strongly, like, don't do anything else.
Yep.
And that breaking my brain at the
Yeah.
time. Like I was already kind of a sketchy prep GM, but not that. Like I couldn't even imagine that.
Yeah.
Uh, and and it took me a long time to internalize that. I ran PbtA before I internalized that
Hmm.
for
Yep.
Rich, and Rich was very nice not to call me out too much on it. And it was only later when I was reading some other sort of things about like how the GM ran, I was like, oh, oh, it is all about reactions.
Yeah. And even looking at dogs for a moment, that carries over into Apocalypse World. I think some people can get the sense that it's like almost a mystery game where like there's a problem in the town that you need to find out. And explicitly in the text, it's like just lay it all out. All the problems, all is involved with everything. They don't need to investigate anything. Like if they ask, everyone will tell them, and then they can respond to the situation. And this
Hmm.
carries over in Apocalypse World. Like don't plan a bunch of stuff in the background that they have to like figure out and tease out. Just like lay everything out up front, and so you have this broad palette for them to play with, and then move forward instead of looking back at the stuff I wrote down when I was putting the game together.
A thing I want to point at, I have some theories I may come back to that may be more conspiratorial than anything, but I do think one of the most interesting things is that Apocalypse World leaves the apocalypse undefined.
Yeah.
We have some bounds for the world. We have a psychic maelstrom. We know kind of what the technology level is. We have this, okay, it's a generation or two removed, but what happened, the apocalypse, the actual specific nature of it, what that looks like, that, like everything else, is not defined. And I originally kind of, when I was writing the notes, I said part of the game's purpose is to figure that out. But now I begin, it doesn't fucking matter. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't. And that's really interesting because like previous to this, like that's what people did with the apocalypse. They
Yeah.
really said it. You know, I'm thinking of GURPS and how it didn't do a post-apocalyptic genre book. There's no book that is for that, but instead did specific things like Horse Clans, War Against the Ch'Tor, Y2K, Reign of Steel, and some alternate worlds. You might consider All Flesh Must Be Eaten generic, but like, no, it's a zombie
Yeah. Yeah.
apocalypse. The closest we got were things like D20 Apocalypse, but that's a source book for D20 Modern, and then it goes, here are the worlds you can choose from.
Right.
The same thing with Core, Down in Flames by Greg Porter. That, again, a pick list of apocalypses. Maybe post-apocalyptic hero for champions, but again, it's a toolbox. The assumption is you're going to build your apocalypse.
Yeah.
You're going to choose it. You're going to construct it. And that is so not what Apocalypse World is about.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much not. Yeah. And I don't even like generic is an interesting way to talk about it because when I think of a generic system or setting, it's very much kind of in the vein of like you can run anything in this, which a lot of people kind of take as you have a thing that you want to play in a system. Here's a system to do it with, as opposed to, and it feels like a subtle difference of like a very open system where it's not like drop in your favorite thing in here and play that, but play in this undefined setting and see what happens. And I like philosophically, that is
Mhm.
the core of PbtA is like
Yeah,
instead of planning ahead, playing to find out. That generic system versus open system is really interesting.
it's generic in the sense that a supers game is often generic in that like you can do any supers game, but it's built to do a supers game.
Yeah.
It has the tools to create the vibe of that genre
Mm-hmm.
without filling in all the details of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And PbtA has been called like a genre simulator often. And I used to think that very strongly, and I don't know if I do anymore, but that's probably a different podcast.
I do agree with you. Like, I think there's a whole conversation that you and I were probably witness to on G Plus when there
Mhm.
were people that came and said, if you're hacking PbtA, you're not a game designer. And that whole thing that speaks to
Yeah.
an interesting set of reactions and backlash
Mhm.
to PbtA
Yeah.
that we got. Uh Sex.
Hmm.
Like, how would you describe people's reaction to the sex moves?
Mixed. um, yeah, I think a lot of, again, there was, kind of the more progressive, edgier people that were like, it is good because there is sex in it, which is true. There are also the traditional, mostly male gamers who were like, I don't want to sit down at my table with my guy friends and pretend to have sex with each other. Sure, yeah, but I think the strongest not argument for it, but like the strongest thing about it is that it just explicitly acknowledges that sex exists in the world and that when you have sex with someone, it changes things,
Hmm.
except for the one playbook, um, which explicitly does not. And yeah, I think that's the most important part of that. Like whether it's prurient or provocative or whatever is almost beside the point. It definitely needs a lot of attention,
Right.
but just acknowledging like there are adults in a world, adults are going to have sex, and when they do, they are people in relationship with each other, and that changes things, and that
Yeah.
affects the game.
It's interesting that that is one of the portions that got a lot of attention amongst the things that people objected to, but it's also one of the things that in that form has not gotten translated out
Yeah.
as much in later games. We see some of it in The Veil. We see
Hmm.
some of it in Apocalypse Keys,
Hmm.
Monster Hearts,
Yeah.
but a lot of that, a lot of people have moved away from that. Now, mind you, I think it is very much in the genre and fits with the Apocalypse world, but it is interesting how much emotional resonance and character interaction is built in into that first edition.
Yeah, and a lot of the media that it takes from like doesn't it has sexual things in it, but it doesn't acknowledge sex as a relational act, really. Like there's a lot of like fetish imagery and exploitation, but not like, hey, here are two people who are doing a thing. How does that change those people? Mostly because of maybe the time period that a lot of that media came out, but I don't see it in a lot of like apocalyptic media, I don't think, except for, and not exactly post-apocalyptic, but one of the media touchstones that I think is key to Apocalypse World that Megan Vincent talked about that almost no one ever acknowledges is Firefly for reasons, but all of the playbooks in the original Apocalypse World were based on the main characters in Firefly.
Oh, wow.
And you can go back and look and make those connections, and that changes the way I looked at that very strongly. And that kind of acknowledges some of the sex as relational stuff that changes people in there. Not as much or as well as it should be, but because Firefly.
One of the things that is interesting too in terms of what the game is about, again, about characters and stuff, it is about community
Mm-hmm.
and community building without there being really explicit systems for that. It it is probably the most emergent thing because there is no, some people have pieces of that, like having a gang or having a location,
Yeah.
but there's no playbook for the community, there's no tracking for the community.
Playbook.
Yeah, there's no, hey, map the community in this way. It is really emergent from there.
Yeah. And that is the like actual punk aesthetic that like especially for Meg, I think came from where punk isn't just an edgy surface thing. Like it is actually caring about other people and like caring about your community. And I think that comes through super strongly, even if it's not explicitly spelled out.
Part of what got me thinking about this is yesterday, I think you saw this as well. There was an article shared by Malcolm Craig,
Mm-hmm.
designer of, I didn't realize at the time, Hot War
Yeah.
and Cold City,
Mm-hmm.
who's done apparently a lot of research on post-apocalyptic RPGs and such. And he published a piece on Twilight 2000, which we talked about a couple of episodes ago. And I had a quote on this because I think it's interesting in terms of what T2000 does during this. He says, in the box set, the text offered a high level, stark, and emotionless description of nuclear confrontation. To use Carol Cohn's memorable phrasing, it offered, quote, sanitized abstractions of death and destruction, unquote. Such abstractions were common throughout Cold War space of American defense intellectuals, war planners, and senior commanders. This game thus replicated an overarching U.S. national security discourse that divested itself from, quote, the emotional, the concrete, the particular, the human bodies and their vulnerability, human
Mm-hmm.
lives and their subjectivity, end quote. While contemporaneous films such as The Day After and Threads vividly and viscerally portrayed the effects of nuclear war, T2000 downplayed that.
Yeah.
And I think, again, we are, let's see, 30, 20, 30 years later,
Mm-hmm.
and we're definitely in the other direction on that.
Yeah. Yeah, and interestingly enough, like I don't think I've ever seen or been a part of an apocalypse world game that was explicitly like post-nuclear, like not the Fallout thing.
Right.
Apocalypse was always, man-made, ecological, biological, something, undefined.
Hmm.
But I've never really experienced the bombs fell, and now this is the world after.
Well, there's no mechanics for radiation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there are now. There's rad harm or
Okay.
harm. Yeah, but yeah, in the original, it's not.
Yeah.
Not.
I mentioned my conspiracy theory about all of this too.
Mm,
There is a certain theory about the reaction of media and literature in the immediate aftermath of 9/11.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
In that the next several years after that, a shift to more escapist fantasy stories, or at least stories that don't function as real critiques
mm-hmm.
of society. But that by the time we get to 2010, we've got the pendulum swinging back the other way. And we're still we're still abstracted from real critiques, but we're starting to see things that are talking about certain destructive impulses and inhumanity. And The Walking Dead is in there. I think Apocalypse World kind of fits in that shift back.
For sure.
Okay, Grant Morrison has a whole thing about Apollonian versus Dionysian
Mhm.
modes of things. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but it does feel like there is a shift there.
It is a framework of looking at things.
Yes.
And I don't know how much of that was, a reaction to like imminence, like the what were 9/11 kind of brought the apocalypse in a very small way to the United States.
Hmm.
I think the like media and social reaction to that was less, oh, here's a problem that we need to address, and more of either like we're the best and they can't do that to us, or it's not a problem and we got it, which neither of which are
Huh.
great
That's an
reactions.
interesting echo of other times,
Yeah,
like the
weird.
modern day. Interesting.
Oh yeah, let's wait for that good media to come out of all this. Yeah, yeah, I see that.
One interesting things I've heard, and I heard this second, third hand, is that there has been like more recently some pushback on games that use PbtA mechanics, like not explicitly labeling them as
Mhm.
PbtA.
Yeah.
And again, this is third hand, but I understand that when Avatar Legends, the Kickstarter was coming out, there was some discussion about de-emphasizing it being PbtA
Hmm.
because they didn't want to associate themselves with the themes of Apocalypse World.
Huh.
And I heard this third hand from some credible sources. And it does strike me like when you go back and look at the Kickstarter, we look at some of the stuff that definitely PbtA isn't used as a selling point there. Now, mind you, they're trying to get a different audience, but it is striking on that, I think.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that's interesting because I've seen a lot of people kind of hold Avatar up as a failure of PbtA almost. Like they kind of, and I don't think this is true, that they kind of rode on the coattails of PbtA to sell Avatar, which seems backwards to me. Like
Yeah, yeah,
you could have used any system and it would have sold exactly as well.
yeah, exactly.
Those mechanics because they were good mechanics for the system.
Yeah, I actually didn't realize it, like for some reason I thought that they had used this whatever system they're using with this Fallen London game. So I
Mm,
kind of lost that in the noise of that whole discussion.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's interesting to see, I'll be really curious. I'll be curious to see how Burned Over does
Yeah.
in our present environment and what it actually does to the table. I know Rich ran a lot of Burned Over, but it kind of kept changing it, and he likes having things good and having the ground solid underneath him. So I think he got a little frustrated with that. So I'm excited to see where that ends up.
Yeah. And Rich and the people in our orbit are, we play online a lot. We make our own character keepers. And when a system changes, there's a lot of work to
Yes, to
um,
check and test and see what has changed, find those
yeah.
differences.
One of the cool things that Burned Over does, the last time I played it, which I think was with Rich a year or so ago, is I forget what they call them, but like they have those like apocalypse setting templates that you can like bring in, and they have pick lists that you can, add evocative elements from. So I think that's an interesting addition there. The the reaction to Burned Over has been, overwhelmingly positive from the people in my sphere. And I think everyone that I know, including myself, is like, I'm going to get it because the bakers are great. It's a good game. I'd love to have this new edition nailed down in a physical book. I don't see the same kind of like buzz around it that you do for a lot of high profile projects. And maybe it's just because it's a third edition of a game that everyone is super familiar with,
Hmm.
or maybe that it is, appealing to a slightly broader audience and like dial back the edginess. Like it's dial back the edginess, but not the punk, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Like it's
yeah, yeah.
feelings, but not the fetish wear and swearing.
It would be interesting to see, especially pointing to Thomas Manuel's article, how much this is a response to the times, like
Mm-hmm.
what it says
Yeah.
about where we're at in our particular American
Yeah.
global context.
Yeah. It's less about kicking in teeth and more about taking care of each other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think actually that's probably a good note for us to end
Yeah.
on. Anything else you want to say?
I think that's a great place to end on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fox World is a great game.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. This has been Roll for Mutation, and this is a product of the Open Hearth gaming community. I say it differently each time. It'd be great if you could rate us, share us, leave comments, all of that kind of thing to get visibility if you're on there. We have a bunch of different series like this in our Around the Hearth feed, including Roll for Origin. And we're doing various talks and seminars. And we have the Open Hearth podcast. And we've got a different kind of Hex, which is a player focused podcast. Marc's been on that. And so we've got a lot in there. So I hope you will check that out. If you dig this, if you're interested in this, hey, you can support us via Patreon. We do have a Patreon for the Open Hearth gaming community that supports everything we do, including these podcasts, which are very much a volunteer
Mm-hmm.
created and done project. Marc, thank you so much for coming and chatting with me.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
And listeners, that is our show.